So I had a request a while back on one of my live streams. I think it was Don actually made this request. I mentioned, because my live streams are sort of wild and crazy compared to these videos, that museums were evil. So I would like to explain to you the justification for that statement. You can agree or disagree, but, figure the whole thing out, listen to my whole thesis, and then decide. So what are museums? So basically, museums are collections of things. Those collections are based on categories. I've been to many museums where I went, these are the dumbest categories ever. Sometimes categories are completely invalid, and that should be obvious, and clearly it's not, because somebody put them in that category. They didn't see it. So categorization itself is already a hard problem to solve, right? Although I would argue there are solutions. One of them is don't put things in museums in general. But museums are for the protection of things as well. And so they're not all downside, certainly. It's been proven over and over again, if you don't take artifacts out of certain countries, Egypt, all of the Arabian Peninsula countries, for some reason, all the Middle East, basically, significant portions of Greece and even Italy, they'll get destroyed. And we'll lose that historical perspective and context. Now, the reason why museums are evil is because when you move things out of their context, they lose meaning. Now, do they have to lose all their meaning? Maybe not. Maybe if you put them in a new context that is close enough to the old one, it's okay. I don't know. It's worth thinking about. But effectively, you're moving the things out of their context. That's already a problem. And then you're typically putting them in a new context, right? Because you're putting them in a new category. That's really two crimes, not one, right? And so, if you're going to do that, you need to do both very, very carefully. So I will just hold up the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and their Egyptian collection. Fairly well done. Haven't gotten to England yet to do the big museum there, the British Museum. Someday would like to spend like a week and a half or a month and a half or perhaps a year and a half in there. Probably will never get the chance, but I can dream. So when you have things, particularly paintings, they typically get sort of moved around based on the artist. Like, it's a Renoir exhibit. Renoir did not want his paintings thought of that way. Are you high on drugs? Renoir wanted his paintings because he, obviously, like most artists, went through these cycles, right? Wanted his paintings grouped differently, the way he grouped them, for example, right? And so they weren't all together under his name. That wasn't how it worked. It's not how it ever works, because the artist is a human being and they change over time, and the world around them changes over time too. It just turns out the universe works that way. It's reality or something annoying like that. And that context plus the content, the painting, is what creates the meaning. That's just how it works. It's how it works with language too. I have a video on that. So museums have to reproduce that to some extent. And A, most people aren't good at it at all and can't do it. And B, it's very hard to do when you're here and need to appreciate a painting of the Netherlands. The Netherlands doesn't make any sense to anyone in the US, probably even if they've been there, because it's a little bit different living in a place from seeing a place that you've never been to. And even if you've not lived there, but you've been there, it's still different, right? There's a novelty effect going on. There's a bunch of things that you see differently. There's a bunch of stuff you don't take for granted that somebody who lives there does take for granted. And that may be why the painting has meaning, by the way. Or it may be part of the meaning of the painting. And this is very famously inverted in the United States by Andy Warhol and his famous Campbell Soup can painting, right? Where he takes a mundane, everyday item and sort of highlights it and quote, calls it art. And I'm sure every critic at the time completely misunderstood what the message was behind that. I'm pretty sure that's been written about before, but that's important, right? Context is very hard to get right. And because you can change the context in which a piece is presented, you can change its meaning. And now you're going against the original intent of the creator of the piece, right? Or the manifester of the piece. And that creates all sorts of problems. Obviously, I've just described postmodernism there. That was no accident. That is one of the things that is sort of causing this. I could easily, and probably will, make the argument that originally museums as originally set up were perfectly okay because they kept as much context as they knew about, and therefore they were doing a much better job than, say, modern museums. When I was in Edinburgh, Scotland, a few years ago, went to a wonderful museum in Inverness. It was awesome. It was all in chronological order. It was great. The museums in Edinburgh, horrible. Absolutely horrible presentation. Could not tell what was going on. I even knew some of that history, and I was like, this doesn't make any sense historically. Why are you doing this? Right? Squishing an entire life into a handful of exhibits just around one person, right? Missing all the important, say, religious context, all the important battles, and all the, right? Just here are the artifacts from this person throughout their life. Pointless exhibit. Totally evil. Descriptions written by people who are saying things like, this hoard of treasure was found, in the neighborhood that I grew up in. Boy, I sure wish I would have found it. I'm like, are you 12? Why are you working in a museum and able to write things for the public? I don't understand. I don't care about that. I want to know something about the hoard. I don't even care necessarily where it was found. I mean, I care where it was found in time, not in place necessarily, unless you want to talk about the larger context of the place. Like we found this in northern Scotland where no one knew that these particular people that left this hoard were there. That would be interesting. It didn't have that information. The context was missing. It was replaced with a different context, which honestly didn't tell a story. Whatever meaning they were shooting for, and I'm sure there was something, I couldn't divine it. I could tell you it wasn't good, right? And so they've misplaced history or displaced history, in some cases deliberately misplacing it, to tell a story that doesn't resemble the historical story, which means we can't extract that historical lesson from the past anymore. It would be better off as an oral tradition at that point. And maybe it needs to be in an oral tradition. I mean, that's how all museums should be. You should go there should be an artifact, and somebody should tell you about the context of the artifact in a story. That might be a better way to do it. Paintings, again, as I mentioned, especially problematic because a lot of people just group paintings like by year made or by artist or by category of style or something garbage like that. Like, I would much rather see all the paintings going on in a given area at a given time of a different style, like one of each style. That's a much more interesting exhibit because it gives you a flavor, not only for the similar enough landscape, like they're all paintings of England, right? From approximately the same, 30-year period, but they were all in different styles, right? That would really give me a better flavor for England. They don't tend to do that in museums. And I'm not saying all museums, right? But also most of them. Seems to be the way these things are done. They're following the fashions of how to run a museum, which is all wrapped up in mimicry, which I should have that live stream out by now, by the time this gets out. And that's, important to understand. Like a lot of the drivers for museums are just not correct. Now, there's a few museums that I love. I do very much like the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I've been there, I don't know, lots of times. Used to live in Boston. The better museum, probably the best museum in the world, as near as anybody can tell, because I said so and it's my channel, is right across the street. It's the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. If you haven't been there, you should go there. If you can't get there, you should do whatever it takes to get there. It is fantastic. Now, this suffers from all of the things I mentioned to some extent. The difference is it was curated by a single person, pretty much. I mean, no museum is curated by a single person, but it was Isabella Stewart Gardner and her tastes that sort of drove the placement of these items in her house. The museum is her house. And so there's a certain specialty to it where the cohesion and the meaning is there. Is it historically accurate and useful meaning? We could definitely debate about that. Probably not. Still my favorite museum for lots of interesting reasons. One of them is that, in my estimation, it does give you a flavor for the things that that she's trying to convey. Like there is a message in the layout of the entire place. Like I don't want to say the items in the house because it's not true. There's a central atrium. There's a theme for the floors, a loose theme. It's a very interesting place because it's done the way it's done. And so, again, not all museums, but there's a big problem when you're just gathering stuff around, and who's trying to tell you what using history, right, or using art. And that's what you need to be mindful of. That's why I sort of made the rather hyperbolic, perhaps and bombastic statement that museums are evil, because they're too prone to this sort of manipulation. And maybe the people doing this don't know how manipulative they're being. Fair enough. It's an issue. It's a problem for sure. But also, there's a message there. You just need to be careful of what it is. So hopefully this gives you sort of a flavor, right? Again, you've got a context where things are and where they are in relation to one another, and the content, the things themselves, the things you've displaced from where you found them or where they were originally situated, and you've replaced them. Now, with art, this is much less of a problem because art was typically commissioned and made to go in a certain place, and a lot of times you can replicate that to some extent because it's sort of loosey-goosey. With history, it's not obvious to me that you should ever play that game. It's just not. So a lot of art and history seems to cross over. Some of it does for sure, but some of it does not. I mean, there are things that are clearly historical that need to be left in a historical context. Again, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston actually does a good job with this, with the Egyptian stuff, for example. They do a fairly decent job of it. I'm sure there are other good museums out there. Unfortunately, I haven't been to enough of them. If you want to see an example of how the goal fits with what you're seeing in the art, you can go to the Peabody. Is it the Peabody Essex Museum of Natural History, and see how they use their exhibits, right, versus an exhibition, for example, at the Museum of Fine Arts works, versus how the history section of the Museum of Fine Arts works, versus the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. That's all in Boston. It's pretty close together. You can get a real flavor for why this matters. And that's how I got the flavor for it. I mean, I grew up in Boston, so I saw these different ways of museuming, if you will. And you go down the street to this to the Museum of Science in Boston, another excellent museum, and see like their whole way of presenting exhibits. And once you sort of zoom out and look at it from that perspective, that's not a meta perspective, by the way. I hate the word meta. If you don't know why, then you can watch this video and kind of find out. You can get this a different perspective on what is here and why is it here and how does it relate to the other objects here and what message is that telling me. You can do that. Most people can do that. You can argue don't do that. It takes a little flavor out of the museum. That's possibly true as well. But it's good to know what you're being enchanted by, and that's a practice that can show you, what to be enchanted by. So museums are tools of enchantment, right? And that's sort of why I was a little hyperbolic about them being evil, but also a lot of them are. So the pure art museums far more prone to evil than anything else. And so it's very important to realize and account for, because you don't want to be exposed to that, unless it's very very carefully and knowingly. So hopefully I didn't expose you to too much of my enchantment. At least I don't think any of it's negative. The purpose of this channel is to do positive enchantment. That's why showing you how to navigate patterns, right? So you can kind of get a feel for this thing, even if you don't sort of understand it rationally and consciously. Hopefully, by engaging with the channel, you'll be able to do this. Just do it and not have to worry about it, which is really good, right? That's really what everybody should want. You should want to be able to navigate the world, navigate the patterns of the world without sort of having to stress about it, put too much thought into it. It should be very intuitive, very natural, very flowy, right? Not flow state, but also flowy, right? It should flow in and out and around you, so that when you're in the world, you know what to avoid and what to pursue. Thank you very much for your time and attention.